The wind howled across the cliffs of Arvanel, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of storms. Below, the sea crashed against jagged rocks, white foam exploding into the dark gray waters. High on those cliffs, in a small village that clung to the edge of the kingdom, 18-year-old Leora walked briskly toward her home. Her dark hair whipped across her face, and her hands clutched the straps of the small bundle she carried. It had been another long day of whispered comments, sidelong glances, and cruel jokes from neighbors. The villagers had always treated her differently. An Omega who had reached 18 without a suitor was rare, almost unheard of, and many had already begun to whisper that she was cursed. Her father, a quiet man with a stooped back from years of labor, was the first to speak as she entered the small cottage. "They came today," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Leora's heart sank. She had known this day would come, though she had prayed for it not to. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother, standing by the hearth, turned pale. "The messenger from the king. They bring a summons." A summons. Her stomach churned as her mind raced. Summonses from the king were never ordinary. They were commands, demands, declarations that could change a life or end it entirely. Before Leora could ask further, her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "We have no choice. The king, he has chosen you." The words hit her like a hammer. The king, not a noble suitor, not a distant relative, but Kael, the Alpha King of Arvanel, 40 years old, widowed, feared across the lands for his strength, his cunning, and the iron will with which he ruled. Me," she stammered, unable to hide the shock and dread in her voice. "Yes," her mother said softly, tears welling in her eyes. "He demands your hand in marriage. The kingdom, it cannot wait. The prophecy." Her voice faltered, but Leora knew the meaning. There were whispers, tales passed down through generations, that a pure, unclaimed Omega could secure the line of the Alpha King. Without her, the kingdom might fall into chaos, or worse, the king's bloodline could end. The weight of destiny pressed down on her. She had never dreamed of being anyone's mate, certainly not the king. She had dreamed of quiet days in her village, tending her garden, perhaps helping her father in his trades, maybe even finding someone who loved her for who she was. Instead, she felt the icy hand of fate clutch her chest. Over the next few days, arrangements were made with frightening efficiency. Carriages were prepared, guards were assigned, and the villagers avoided her as if mere proximity might bring them misfortune. Leora walked through it all in a haze, her mind spinning with fear and disbelief. Finally, the day came when she had to leave. She stood at the edge of her village, looking back at the familiar fields and cottages, and felt tears prick her eyes. She had no choice. Yet the thought of stepping into the unknown made her heart hammer like a drum in a storm. The carriage that would take her to the capital gleamed in black and gold, the royal crest painted proudly on the side. 2 guards opened the doors, bowing their heads, but offering no comfort. Leora climbed inside, her hands shaking as the door shut behind her. The road to the capital was long and treacherous. Mountains rose on either side, forests whispered secrets of unseen creatures, and rivers carved silver lines through the land. Leora tried to calm her thoughts, focusing on the passing scenery, but her mind returned again and again to the same question. What was Kael like? Stories had traveled even to her small village. Kael was ruthless, some said cruel. He had crushed rebellions, executed traitors, and ruled with a hand of iron. And yet, there were tales of his quiet grief, the sorrow that lingered after the death of his queen. Was he lonely? Was he bitter? Would he despise her for being young, untested, and fragile in his eyes? As the carriage rolled through a narrow pass, a sudden storm struck. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rattled the carriage frame. Leora clutched her bundle closer, fear mingling with the thrill of the unknown. When the carriage finally emerged from the storm into the outskirts of the capital, she felt a shiver run through her spine. The city of Arvenel was unlike anything she had ever seen. Towering spires reached into the clouds, and the streets buzzed with merchants, soldiers, and townspeople from across the kingdom. Enchanted lanterns glowed with a soft magical light, and statues of long-dead kings and queens stood at every corner, their eyes seeming to follow her as the carriage rolled past. At last, they reached the palace gates. Leora's breath caught. The walls were impossibly tall, crowned with banners that fluttered in the wind. Guards in polished armor stood at attention, and the air felt thick with power and expectation. This was the seat of the Alpha King. This was Kale's world. The carriage came to a halt, and the guards opened the doors. Leora stepped out, her legs trembling under her, and walked up the steps to the grand doors. They opened slowly with a deep, echoing creak, revealing a hall of marble and shadow, lit by flickering torches that made the walls dance with light. And then she saw him. King Kale stood at the end of the hall, his figure tall and commanding. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples, and his eyes were sharp, calculating, like blades honed by decades of experience. He wore a robe of deep crimson trimmed with gold that spoke of authority and strength. Even from across the hall, she felt his presence like a physical force, pulling at her, testing her, daring her to step forward. For a moment, neither spoke. Leora felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity, repulsion and fascination. She had imagined many things in the days leading up to this, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of his gaze. Finally, Kale's voice broke the silence, low and commanding. "You are Leora of the Clifftop Village?" She nodded, unable to speak, her throat dry. "You have been chosen," he continued, his tone even but edged with steel. "Not by desire, but by necessity. You will bear the next of my line. Your compliance is expected, and your life for now remains yours only under my roof." The words were cold, almost brutal in their clarity. Leora felt the weight of the royal decree settle over her, suffocating and absolute. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something she did not understand, a sense that her life, as terrifying as it was about to become, might also hold a strange kind of possibility. Over the next days, Leora was introduced to the palace and its rigid rules. Servants and guards watched her with curiosity and caution, some pitying her, some wary of her status as the king's chosen Omega. Kale observed her as well, his eyes never leaving her for long, studying her reactions, her strength, her fears. She found the palace both awe-inspiring and suffocating. The halls were wide and shadowed, filled with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her. Gardens stretched out behind the palace walls, fountains singing under the moonlight, and yet every step she took was measured. Every word she spoke weighed against invisible expectations. Kyle visited her daily, sometimes in the council chambers, sometimes in the library, sometimes in the gardens. He was always distant, always testing her, asking questions not for her answers, but to see her spirit. Leora, in turn, learned to guard herself, to navigate the strange balance between obedience and autonomy. One evening, under the light of a blood-red moon, Leora wandered the palace gardens alone. The scent of night-blooming flowers mingled with the crisp chill of the air. She thought of her village, her family, the life she had been forced to leave behind. And then she saw him, Kyle, standing silently beneath an ancient oak, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You walk freely at night," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Danger does not sleep, even for the king's chosen. I am not afraid, Leora replied, though her heart raced. Kale stepped closer, and for the first time, the formality, the power, the distance between them softened, just slightly. Fear is not weakness. It is the measure of what matters to you. Their hands brushed accidentally as he handed her a small, ornate lantern. A spark of electricity, or perhaps destiny, passed between them. Leora pulled back, startled by the intensity of the moment. Kale's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, but the weight of his authority remained. You are not like the others, he murmured. Perhaps that is why fate chose you. Perhaps that is why the kingdom still breathes. Leora's pulse raced, confusion and curiosity twisting inside her. She did not understand his words, yet their significance lingered, like a whisper carried on the wind. As she turned to leave, the sky above darkened further, and a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the palace in stark white light. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. In that instant, Leora felt the truth of her new life. It would not be easy, it would not be gentle, and it would demand everything she had: courage, strength, and the impossible, the surrender of a heart that had only ever known rejection. And yet, as Kale's eyes met hers one last time that night, she sensed that the storm outside was only the beginning. The storm within, between destiny, duty, and desire, was only just awakening. The palace of Arvenel was a living, breathing entity, as if every stone and shadow carried the weight of centuries. Its corridors stretched endlessly, echoing with footsteps, whispers, and the soft flicker of enchanted torches. Leora, now a guest of the king, walked these halls with a mixture of awe and dread. Every glance from the guards, every tilt of a painting's eye seemed to remind her she was no longer free. Yet within this fear, a spark of curiosity stirred. The palace was beautiful in ways she had never imagined. Its gardens bloomed under moonlight, fountains sang in gentle rhythms, and tapestries whispered the tales of kings and queens long gone. But beauty was paired with danger. Politics, magic, and centuries of expectation hovered over her like an invisible shroud. Kale, the Alpha King, observed her constantly. His presence was a silent force, pressing against her, testing her, shaping her. He was not cruel in the obvious sense, but he ruled with precision, demanding obedience while withholding warmth. Every word, every glance, seemed calculated to gauge her strength. "Why do you watch me so?" Leora asked one morning as Kale appeared silently behind her while she studied the intricate tapestries in the east wing. Kale's eyes narrowed, not with anger but with quiet curiosity. "Because you are the key," he said. "The kingdom needs more than a name beside mine. You must learn to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be." Leora bristled. "I do not belong here. I am not ready." Kale's gaze did not waver. "None are ever ready for destiny. That does not excuse weakness." She looked down at her hands, feeling the cold metal of the bracelet she now wore, a subtle mark of her status as the king's chosen Omega. It was simple, yet heavy with meaning, a reminder that she belonged to the palace now, whether she wished it or not. The days blended into weeks. Leora was introduced to courtly rituals, magical lessons, and the expectations of an Omega who might one day bear the king's heir. Every step was a lesson in subtlety. Guards watched her, servants tested her knowledge, and nobles whispered behind her back. Some pitied her, some admired her, but none treated her as an equal. Kale, however, treated her differently. He challenged her, not with harshness, but with subtle tests. One day he placed a silver goblet on the table before her and asked, "What would you do if a courtier tried to deceive you?" Leora frowned, unsure. I would listen carefully, observe, and wait for proof. I would not act rashly." Kyle studied her quietly. Good. Strength is not always in force. Sometimes it is in patience. Despite the coldness in his voice, Leora felt a flicker of approval. A recognition she had never known. Kale was teaching her, yes, but more than that, he was acknowledging her. Slowly she realized that he did not see her as fragile or insignificant. He saw potential. But potential came with pressure. The palace was full of traps, both literal and figurative. A rival noble tried to embarrass her during a formal gathering, accusing her of ignorance in front of the council. Leora's heart pounded, her face flushed, but she remembered Kale's lessons. She held her head high, replied calmly with the truth, and deflected the insult with dignity. Kale, watching from the shadows, allowed a faint smile to cross his face. She had passed the test. Yet she sensed that every success was only the beginning of the challenges to come. Despite her growing confidence, Leora could not ignore the tension between them. Kyle was a man of extremes. At times, he was cold and unyielding, speaking of duty and destiny as if emotions were a luxury. At other times, glimpses of vulnerability appeared. A hand trembling slightly while reviewing documents, a sigh that betrayed loneliness, or a gaze that lingered on her longer than necessary. One evening, the palace was quiet, the corridors empty except for the soft rustle of robes and the whisper of torches. Leora found herself in the library, the scent of old books and parchment filling her senses. Kyle appeared suddenly as he always did, his presence filling the room with gravity. "You are learning fast," he said, his voice softer than usual. "But knowledge is not enough. You must understand power and the weight it carries." Leora turned to him, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "And what is power if it cannot be shared?" Kale paused, studying her. For a moment, the harsh mask of the king faltered. He did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Finally, he said, "Power that is not controlled destroys everything, but perhaps there is truth in your words." Leora felt a shiver run through her. She did not fully understand what she had said, yet the effect on Kyle was undeniable. It was the first time she had seen him hesitate, consider, rather than command. Days later, a rumor reached the palace that a curse might affect the royal bloodline. Whispers spoke of ancestors who had fallen because the Alpha King had taken an Omega unwillingly. The court grew tense. Even Kyle, usually composed, displayed a rare flicker of unease. He summoned Leora to the moonlit garden that night. The fountains shimmered under the light of the stars, and the air smelled of roses and rain. "The curse is real," he said, his voice low. "If the bond between the king and the Omega is broken, the line ends. The kingdom could crumble." Leora felt a chill. She had not anticipated being caught in a web of magic and destiny so quickly. "Then, what do I do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You survive," Kale said simply. "You learn, you endure, and perhaps in time you may even choose. But choice comes with trust, and trust is earned, not demanded." Their eyes met, and for a long moment, the world seemed to shrink around them. Leora felt something stir inside her, a mix of fear, defiance, and an inexplicable attraction she did not understand. Kale's presence was overwhelming, yet oddly protective, and the thought that he might be capable of more than cold authority intrigued her. The tension between them became a silent dance. Every encounter, every glance, carried meaning beyond words. Leora found herself both resisting and drawn to him. Kyle, in turn, seemed to struggle with his own feelings, maintaining distance yet unable to ignore the Omega before him. One night, during a particularly fierce storm, Leora could not sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and the shadows of the trees moved like living creatures. She wandered the palace, drawn to the gardens, where the moonlight painted silver patterns across the marble fountains. Kyle was there, waiting. He did not speak immediately, simply watching her approach. When she reached him, he finally said, "The storm mirrors what is to come. Choices, danger, desires. They all clash in ways that cannot be controlled." Leora shivered, feeling the storm not just around them, but inside her. "And what do you want, Kyle?" she asked quietly, the words trembling on her lips. He did not answer at once. Instead, he reached out, a hand hovering near hers. Their fingers brushed accidentally, and a current seemed to pass between them. Leora pulled back instinctively, startled by the intensity of the moment. Kale's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, but the authority remained. "Do not mistake closeness for consent," he said, "and yet, do not deny what is already stirring." The words, ambiguous and heavy with meaning, left Leora's heart pounding. She felt both fear and curiosity, and a strange, unnameable desire she could not yet understand. It was the first true crack in the wall she had built around herself, the first hint that her fate in this palace might not be solely one of submission and duty. The days that followed were filled with subtle tests, both magical and political. Leora discovered she had abilities she had never known, small threads of empathy and intuition that allowed her to navigate the palace's intricate network of power. She began to understand the delicate balance required to survive here, to earn respect, and perhaps even influence her own destiny. Kyle watched her closely, sometimes approvingly, sometimes critically. Their interactions were a constant battle of wills, of respect and restraint, of silent acknowledgement of mutual strength. Each glance, each word, carried layers of meaning, and the tension between them became almost unbearable. Then, one night, a message arrived from the kingdom's northern border. Rebels threatened the lands, exploiting the king's absence from the front lines. The palace was thrown into chaos. Leora, despite her fear, offered insight into how the threat might be countered, using her understanding of the land and the people. Kale listened, truly listened, and then nodded. "Perhaps you are stronger than I first thought," he said. "Not just in mind, but in spirit. The kingdom may need you more than you realize." The acknowledgement, simple though it was, ignited a spark within her. She realized that in this palace of power, fear, and destiny, she might find not just survival, but purpose. And perhaps even a connection with the man who had seemed so distant, so untouchable. Yet as the night deepened and the storm raged outside, a sense of unease settled over her. The bond between them, growing stronger with every challenge, was also a bond that could be dangerous. Fate had brought them together, but the forces around them were unpredictable, and the kingdom itself was a crucible that tested every heart, every choice. And then, as lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the palace towers, Leora realized that the greatest storm of all was not the one outside. It was the one rising inside her, between desire, duty, and the undeniable pull of the Alpha King. The first light of dawn spilled over the palace towers, illuminating the gardens where Leora had spent so many quiet nights thinking, learning, and growing. She had changed. The frightened Omega who had arrived weeks ago was gone, replaced by a young woman who carried herself with quiet strength and determination. The palace no longer felt like a prison, but a stage where she was slowly learning the rules of power and the language of trust. Yet, with change came danger. The northern border of the kingdom burned with rebellion, and the whispers of curses and prophecy still echoed through the halls. The kingdom's enemies were emboldened by Kyle's focus on the palace, believing that the royal line was vulnerable. For the first time, Leora realized that her role was no longer passive. She was part of the kingdom's fate, entwined with the Alpha King's destiny in ways that could not be undone. Kale stood in the council chamber, tall and commanding, yet the wear of years weighed visibly on him. His dark eyes scanned the maps before him, tracing the borders with a finger, as if willing the lines to hold. He did not see Leora enter, but she watched him from the doorway, noting the tension in his shoulders and the flicker of worry behind his eyes. "You are quiet today," he said without looking up. "You think too much." "I am learning," Leora replied, stepping closer. "I must understand, not just survive." Kyle's gaze finally met hers, and for a moment the ice of authority softened. "Perhaps that is why you were chosen. Perhaps you are more than fate required." The words struck her. For the first time, Kale's respect was explicit, a recognition that went beyond duty or prophecy. Leora felt a flicker of warmth amidst the fear, a sense that perhaps the Alpha King's heart was not entirely closed to her presence. The court moved like a living web of power, each noble, servant, and guard a thread to be understood and navigated. Leora's days became lessons in diplomacy, subtle influence, and courage. She learned to observe, to anticipate, to act with precision. She discovered that her Omega instincts, long scorned and dismissed, were a quiet strength, allowing her to sense truths beneath the surface of courtly pretense. One evening, Kyle summoned her to the gardens again. The fountains shimmered under the moonlight, and the air was rich with the scent of night-blooming flowers. The stars above glimmered like scattered diamonds, and the world seemed hushed in anticipation. "You have grown stronger," Kale said quietly. "Stronger than I imagined. Stronger than even I could command." Leora hesitated, unsure how to respond. Strength was something she had discovered within herself. But acknowledgement from Kale carried a weight that made her heart pound. I have learned from you," she admitted. "From your example." Kale's eyes softened, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. "Perhaps we have learned from each other," he said. The statement, simple though it was, carried more meaning than either of them could yet articulate. The tension that had simmered between them, the mix of fear, curiosity, and unspoken desire, had shifted. They were no longer merely King and Omega. They were allies, equals in subtle ways, and the bond between them had begun to deepen. But peace in the palace was fragile. The rebels from the north had grown bolder, launching attacks on border villages and sending messages meant to provoke fear. Kyle prepared to ride to the front lines, commanding his army with precision, yet he hesitated. Leora stood at his side, silent but unwavering. "You should not go alone," she said, her voice steady. "Your strength is great, but even the strongest can fall. Let me help." Kyle turned to her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You would go with me?" "I am not afraid," she said. "And I know the land, the people. I can help guide the army, protect those who need it. We do this together, or not at all." For the first time, Kale saw not the frightened Omega who had arrived at his palace weeks ago, but a partner. He studied her, weighing the risks, the benefits, and the bond they had begun to forge. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. We ride at first light." The journey north was perilous. The forests were thick with shadows, the rivers swollen from recent storms, and the paths treacherous. Leora moved beside Kale, silent and alert, reading the land and its dangers with a clarity born of instinct and observation. Kale, meanwhile, rode with the precision of a seasoned commander, yet he often glanced at her, acknowledging her presence in subtle ways that conveyed trust and recognition. On the third day, they reached a village threatened by rebels. Smoke rose from the cottages, and frightened villagers cowered in the streets. Kyle's soldiers moved swiftly, forming defensive lines, but it was Leora who spotted the hidden paths the rebels used to approach undetected. "Here," she said, pointing to a narrow trail partially obscured by brush. "They will come this way. We can ambush them before they reach the village." Kyle nodded, impressed. "You see what others cannot," he said quietly. "Your instincts, they are invaluable." The battle that followed was fierce, but brief. With Leora's guidance and Kale's strategy, the rebels were driven back, and the village saved. Leora saw the fear in their eyes turn to gratitude, the despair of the oppressed replaced by hope. And in that moment, she understood something she had never known before. She had power, influence, and a role in shaping the world around her. After the battle, as the sun set and the sky glowed with shades of crimson and gold, Kyle and Leora stood together on a ridge overlooking the village. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and earth, but also with the quiet satisfaction of victory. "You did well," Kyle said softly. "Better than I expected." Leora looked at him, her heart pounding. "We did it together," she replied. Kyle's eyes held hers. And in that moment, the barriers between them seemed to fall away. There was no king, no Omega, no prophecy, only two souls standing together amidst chaos, fear, and duty. But destiny, as always, is never satisfied with peace. That night, a messenger arrived with urgent news. A rival noble seeking to exploit the kingdom's instability had infiltrated the palace. The city itself was under threat, and the royal line was in danger. Kyle and Leora returned to the capital swiftly, their bond strengthened but tested anew. The palace, once a place of distant authority and shadowed halls, now felt like a crucible. Every step, every decision carried the weight of the kingdom's survival. Inside the throne room, Kyle addressed his council. "The threat is real," he said, voice steady but edged with urgency. "We must act with precision, or all that we have fought for will be lost." Leora stood beside him, her presence calm and resolute. "We will face it together," she said. "The kingdom, the people, they are not yours or mine alone. We are responsible." Kale turned to her, his gaze lingering longer than usual. In that moment, the prophecy, the curse, the fear, all seemed less important than the bond they had forged. Leora's courage, wisdom, and steadfastness had earned not only Kale's respect, but also his trust, and perhaps something more profound, a connection neither had dared to name aloud. The night descended, and with it, the final challenge. Rebels stormed the palace gates, their intentions clear and deadly. Alarms rang, soldiers rushed to their posts, and the air was thick with tension. Leora, standing at Kyle's side, felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment where fate and choice collided. Kale drew his sword, the steel gleaming in torchlight, and turned to her. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying the weight of command. Leora nodded. "I am." The battle was fierce. Shadows moved like living creatures, steel clashed, and magic flickered through the air. Leora guided soldiers, protected innocents, and used her instincts to anticipate the enemy's moves. Kale fought with precision, his experience and strength unmatched, yet he never strayed from her side. Together, they became a force greater than the sum of their parts, a partnership born of respect, trust, and the recognition of each other's strengths. When the final enemy was driven back and silence returned to the palace, Leora and Kyle stood together amidst the ruins, breathing heavily, but alive. The kingdom had been saved, not by prophecy alone, but by courage, trust, and the bond between them. Kale turned to Leora, his eyes soft but intense. "You have proven yourself," he said quietly, "not as an Omega, not as a chosen one, but as a person of strength, wisdom, and heart. You have earned more than survival. You have earned my trust." Leora's chest swelled with pride and relief. "And you have taught me," she said softly, "not just how to survive, but how to stand, how to face fear, and how to believe in myself." For the first time, the distance between them closed. Kale reached for her hand, and this time, Leora did not pull away. Their fingers intertwined, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared, the battles they had fought, and the bond that had grown stronger with each trial. The palace, though scarred by conflict, seemed lighter somehow. Shadows still lingered, and the future held unknown challenges, but for the first time, Leora understood that destiny was not merely imposed, it could be shaped, guided, and shared. As they stood together, gazing out over the city they had saved, a quiet understanding passed between them. They were not just king and omega, not just ruler and chosen, they were allies, equals, and something more profound, something that neither power nor fear nor prophecy could erase.